Today, I want to talk about what I feel like is a slept on corner of collecting, but it's one of my favorites. Not because it's obscure, it might be the most common category of watches around, instantly recognizable from Timex, Hamilton, all the way up to Rolex. It's got its origins in World War II, but its DNA can be seen in watches from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, all the way up to today, some of the most iconic sports watches we all know and love. Today, we're going to talk about collecting the field watch from the 1940s through the mid-century, all the way to the 2020s. We're also going to tell the story of some of the most expensive field watches we've ever seen at auction. A little bit more modestly, I'll talk about some of those that I've owned, some of those I've let go, and why. Before we get to that, my name's Tony. I started a regular newsletter about watches called Unpolished after a couple of years as an editor at Hodinkee. As I think you'll see in this video, I like vintage watches in particular, so if that suits you, please subscribe below. This is also just our 5th YouTube video, so please subscribe to the channel and leave a like while you're there. So like I said, the field watch has its origins in World War II in the 1940s. Let's think about what wristwatches still were at that time. In the 1920s and 30s, we saw all kinds of watches. The Cartier Tank, the Jaeger-LeCoultre Reverso, all of these Art Deco designs with weird shapes, not just round watches, but triangles, rectangles, trapezoids, everything. It was really World War II and the war effort that standardized the round wristwatch as the watch, and that's because militaries around the world needed a standardized watch type for all of their soldiers as they went off to fight. So one of the most famous ones that I wanted to talk about is the Dirty Dozen watches. These are watches that were commissioned in the 1940s by the British Ministry of Defense for all of their soldiers fighting in World War II. They commissioned 12 brands. I'll list off a few of them. There's Jaeger-LeCoultre, Longines, IWC. There's more. There's 12 in total, but as you can tell, it's some of the Swiss brands we recognize. The specs were common across all of the brands, so they would make slightly different movements, but aesthetically, they had to be the exact same. Black dial, Arabic numerals, in the time radium luminous material so that they could glow in the dark. There's 3 W's on the back even. They stood for watch, wrist, waterproof. Basically tells you everything the watch did, and that's it. I love the broad arrow on these watches too. You usually see it at 6 o'clock, just indicating the origins of these. Instantly gives it away as a product of the British military. There's definitely military watch collectors. That's like a whole segment of watch collecting. I like these from the field watch perspective though, just as the foundation of some of the watches we'll get to here in a second, the Hamilton Khaki, Rolex Explorer, and so on. These watches in particular though, I don't like to collect them. One reason is like kind of ruthlessly practical. They have fixed spring bars, so unlike the spring bars that are mostly removable nowadays, even if they give you trouble, they weren't removable here, so it requires some sort of specialized strap, something passed through, like a NATO usually. And I'm personally like, I just don't like NATO straps. I don't like how they wear on my wrist. So these watches, I appreciate them for the history. And it's great if you do like them because you can pick them up, some of these brands that we know even today, IWC, JLC, Omega, for a few $1,000s. There are Dirty Dozen collectors who will try to collect the entire dozen from all of those brands. And some of them are a little bit obscure. So Grana, for example, is notoriously hard to find. Those will be more expensive. It's estimated that Grana made like less than 2,000 of these Dirty Dozen watches. I wrote down a few other numbers. So it's estimated Omega made more like 25,000, JLC made 10,000 on down the line. So the bigger brands made a lot more. But it makes it fun to collect for people. Otherwise, if it's something that you just want to get into, you want to get a taste for military watch collecting, it's a great place to start because when you get into Submariners, dive watches, they get much more expensive more quickly. And these are tiny watches, old watches too, 1940s, that are a little bit more obscure, a little bit more niche. So that's the 1940s, but if you want to understand the evolution of the field watch, you have to look at the Rolex Explorer. So let's get into the 1950s. The reference 6298 from the early 1950s at Rolex is where it starts. This is the Explorer or the pre-Explorer. This is the reference that Rolex supplied to Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay when they summited Mount Everest. I'm not going to get into the Rolex versus Smith's discussion right now. It's probably the case that they weren't wearing this watch, but they did have a variety of watches in their kit as they summited Mount Everest. And Rolex is a great marketer, so they've used that to their advantage over the years. And the Explorer is even thought of as more of a mountaineering watch sometimes because of that famous ad than a field watch. But it is kind of a classic field watch. So it's got the origins and the DNA of those Dirty Dozen watches I mentioned, but it whittles it down to just those 369 numerals. Still got a black dial. That's about it though. After the 6298, which is really a pre-Explorer, we get to the real Explorer watches. They actually say Explorer on the dial. These are some of my favorite watches ever. In general, 1950s Rolex is just beautiful. There's so much variety. They have these beautiful gilt dials that have a richness, a glossiness that later watches don't necessarily have, but they're really hard to find. I almost think of these as like the Paul Newman of the Explorer category. So these references are the 6150, 6350, and 6610. My favorite watch type in this category is these textured waffle dials that you can sometimes see. This is also the era where these watches have real mountaineering provenance. So I mentioned some of the most expensive field watches or field watch category watches are these Rolex watches from the Explorer family from this era that have ties to real hikers, real mountaineers, real explorers. I want to tell you about one of them. I covered this when I was at Hodinkee. It was a reference 6298. I've got some photos of it here from Jurg Marmet. So this was a watch that was issued to him for an expedition to an island called Baffin Island. If you look at a map of Canada, it's way at the very, very top, like in the Arctic Circle practically. He was issued it for that expedition, and then he never gave it back. And he went on the first Swiss expedition to summit Everest a year after that. So this is a watch that went to the top of the world, almost to the Arctic Circle, and then it went to the summit of Everest after that. This watch sold for almost $300,000 a few years ago. I believe it came from Marmot's family, and it's just one of the most beautiful watches. Look at the patina of this thing. It's you can tell that it was well worn, well enjoyed, just a beautifully honest field watch. This is exactly how you want to find them. So that's the 1950s for the Rolex Explorer. But the 1960s is when it really becomes established and standardized, like so many of the other sports watches in the Rolex category. In 1960, Rolex introduced the 1016 Explorer. This is a watch that would stay in production from the 1960s all the way until 1989. There's a few important differences we're going to talk about, but it was largely the same watch, 369 numerals, black dial, and that's about it. That's why it's probably the most accessible of kind of the classic sports watches. More affordable than a GMT Master, Submariner, definitely the Daytona. It also happens to be one of my favorites. I feel like it's the most wearable. It's 36 millimeters, about 10 millimeters thick, maybe more like 11, 12 when you include the domed sapphire crystal. But I just find it a super wearable, discreet watch. Usually came on an oyster bracelet, though you can find it on a Jubilee too, which is kind of a cool look for something different. But probably the most wearable and day-to-day enjoyable of like the vintage sports watches from Rolex. Still a fan favorite. Sometimes you ask dealers and they'll say that the 1016 is like their most requested watch just because it's so enjoyable for any number of wrists. I was trying to find the most expensive 1016 that's ever sold. I think it was this albino Explorer 1016 that sold in 2023 at Phillips for about $100,000. So rare white dial. These are interesting watches. They're definitely legit. They're definitely correct. They definitely existed. It's hard to know like what dial was born in what watch, but this was a really, really cool watch. I actually saw it in person when I was at Hodinkee covering auctions at the time. I do prefer the black dial, the classic look. It's just got a little bit more interest. These white ones are a little bit flat. And especially in that era, the gilt dials had a lot more kind of luster to them. So you see those types of dials through the 1960s, basically around 1967 is when Rolex began to change. That's also when they changed their the luminous material that they were using, radioactive radium and then tritium in the 70s and 80s. So the 70s and 80s is also when we see the move towards matte dials. These are kind of the more classic dials that we know that are a flat matte black pad printed numerals and logos and Rolex and all of that on the dial. More sporty, more efficient. They feel more instrument-like than the glossy, rich galvanic dials. But I prefer wearing them day to day just because you don't have to worry about the fragility of like a 1950s or 60s watch. The Explorer I own, for example, is a 1980s matte dial. So how much does it cost to get a 1016 nowadays? You can find some of these matte dials for as low as I would say 10 to 12. Although, as a general rule for vintage Rolex, you don't want to get the cheapest one you can find on the market. You want to prioritize condition and originality. So you might have to spend a little bit more than that if you're prioritizing all of those things. But look towards a later matte dial, 10 all the way up to maybe $25,000, $30,000 if something's really sharp case, really beautiful lume, patina, all of those types of things. All of that's a little bit subjective, obviously. So don't listen to dealers and decide what you like and what you can handle from your perspective. A polish or two is fine to me on a 1016 because The case doesn't have the bevels of a Submariner or GMT Master, but after that, it can get a little bit soft looking. After the 1016 came the 14270, the Rolex Explorer from the 1990s. So this is actually the first Rolex I ever bought myself years ago. Really beautiful watch. They're great, but honestly, Rolex offers the 36 millimeter Explorer again. It didn't at the time when I was looking to get into Rolex and looking for an Explorer. The new 36 millimeter Explorer is really nice. I might just counsel someone to get that. Though, of course, if you got a chance to check out a 14270 and compare the two, do it. But that's kind of the modern lineage of Explorers. They start to feel like more luxury watches to me. The 1016 keeps the DNA of the field watch. Like the matte dial of the 1016 feels so pure. The modern Rolex watches are a little bit glossier, a little bit shinier. The numerals have those surrounds, those white gold surrounds that make it feel like more of a luxury product. So the 1016 to me is the perfect medium. Next, I want to talk about perhaps the most well-known American watch company. Hamilton really started making watches for the military in World War I. By World War II, they stopped making civilian watches entirely so that they could support the war effort. So the watch that most people is probably most associated with the Hamilton name nowadays is the Hamilton Khaki Field. It comes in all kinds of varieties. You can probably find it for $500 or $600 at your local Macy's. I recommend it all the time to people who are looking to get their first mechanical watch. I feel like it's the most non-offensive watch you can find. Still a great value proposition. I still love them. I still have a vintage Khaki Field that I wear all the time. But this watch has its origins in a military spec. So this was military spec GGW 113. It has its origins sort of in the 60s and 70s. Hamilton made thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these. I don't know. It's one of the first eBay searches I followed, and I still get a few pings for it every single week. It's cool to see on the back that it has an engraving. You can see when it was made, who it was made for, and the spec on it. I love these watches. They're about 33, 34 millimeters. They've got some of the callbacks to those Dirty Dozen watches or the similar watches that were issued to the US military at the time, but just pure field watches that don't have a whole lot more and don't need a whole lot more. You can just imagine if you were a soldier at the time being handed your uniform, your boots, and this manual wind watch, and it was all supposed to last you. So in the 1980s, Hamilton launched the Khaki Field for the civilian market. It was based off of that military spec watch, but it's got this cool khaki logo at 6 o'clock. I also really like, and I've written about before, some of the retailer ones that you can find. So you can find LL Bean, Orvis, REI, some other rare ones that are kind of cool to hunt out and look for. You can imagine getting an LL Bean catalog in the 80s and 90s. I know I did at the time, and my parents would always let me order one or two things, never a watch, unfortunately. But you can imagine this being sort of a mail order watch almost. Hamilton and LL Bean, some of the best in old American manufacturing, really. By the way, if you're looking for a modern version, I've said that the Hamilton Khaki Field Mechanical is a great watch, but I've seen that they just announced a limited edition for the 250th anniversary of America. Really cool, faithful to the sort of original specs almost. It's 36 millimeters. It's got fixed lugs. Again, it kind of takes it out of the consideration for me, but a really cool watch to celebrate the U.S. heritage of Hamilton, in my opinion. By the way, it wasn't just Hamilton that was making watches for the U.S. military. Most notably, Marathon and Benris were also issuing watches for that same spec at the time. Again, fun watches to hunt down. No reason to spend more than $1,000 on any of these watches. Some of the first vintage watches that I was collecting, you can find them on eBay. You can find them from all kinds of different dealers all day long, under $1,000. It's not as complicated as some of the other vintage watches that you might collect because if you think about it, there's so few components. There's a dial, there's hands, there's case. There's not much room for funny business that you can get into with so many other types of vintage watches, which is kind of one of the reasons I love it is they feel like honest vintage watches. There's not enough money in them and there's just not enough room for people to kind of fiddle around and play with them. Before we get to one more field watch, it's one of my favorite I've owned. I want to talk about the straps in the unpolished store. Like field watches, these go with everything. We've got a selection of canvas and matte calfskin straps. They would look great on field watches, old and new. You can dress them up, you can dress them down. The canvas strap in particular is great for summer. Unlike most canvas straps, this one doesn't have any lining in it. There's no leather lining, so it's less than 2 millimeters thick. It comes out of the box, super fresh, comfy, and flexible. It's just ready to be worn all summer, super breathable, 100% cotton, made in the United States, stitched in the United States. If you're interested, you've got a field watch that could use a little bit of dressing up, check out the Unpolished store, shop.unpolishedwatches.com. Finally, we're going to talk about a watch that I feel like is going to get some comments for even being included in the field watch video, but let me tell you why it counts. So the IWC Mark series technically has its origins as a pilot watch. The IWC Mark 11 is one of the most respected, most successful post-war watches that's got its origins, I feel, in the Dirty Dozen, as well as its pilot's watch inspiration. So after it was made for the Royal Air Force, IWC actually started making civilian watches as well for the Mark 11, and it made these through the 1980s, so you can find lots of them. It's not exactly the watch for me, the successor is, which I'm going to get to in a minute here, but you can find a Mark 11 for less than $10,000 still. After the Mark 11 in the 1990s, though, IWC introduced the Mark 12, and for me, this is where it's at. I want to do a video about actually 1990s IWC. I feel like there's so much storytelling and so many great collectible watches in this period that are pretty accessible. Let me know if that's a video that you would watch in the comments. But for me, the Mark 12 is the one. It was introduced in 1994. I think it's a super interesting watch for collectors. There's a Jaeger-LeCoultre caliber 920 movement inside. It's 36 millimeters, matte dials, simple Arabic numerals, a great little date window as well. We still have the Mark series today. We're on the Mark 20 now. But some of the ones after the Mark 12 are pretty good, pretty wearable watches. But to me, the Mark 12 is the classic. It was the last one that was 36 millimeters. And there's so much of that storytelling of 1990s IWC. We've talked before about the importance of Günter Blümlein in that era, and IWC is where he expressed sort of the more masculine side of Schaffhausen watchmaking. To me, the Mark 12 is actually kind of a little bit more diminutive or delicate even because of that size. It's got this beautiful beads of rice bracelet. One of the best bracelets I've ever owned, one of the best I've worn, especially in steel. Beads of rice, super, super beautiful on the wrist. It articulates very, very nicely, silky smooth. It's actually crazy. I was looking back. I bought one probably 7-8 years ago now for about $4,000, $4,200. I was talking to a dealer friend who sold one last week, full set on bracelet for $7,200. It's still not a bad price when you consider the way everything else in watches has gone, but they've gone up considerably. I would say you'll see these a lot with sort of this black calfskin strap as well. Wait for one with the bracelet and you'll thank me later. It's worth the wait. It's worth the additional price as well. So much of the charm of this watch is in the bracelet. It looks good on a variety of straps, but you've got to get that 1990s IWC bracelet. Of course, there are many other field watches you could look at. The Mark 12, the Hamilton Khaki, and the Rolex Explorer, to me, are the most important lineages, not only in the history, but also the most interesting in terms of collectability. The story is there, the wearability is there. They just kind of encapsulate everything that I love about the field watch. I want to give a few general rules about collecting field watches, because these aren't necessarily like collecting other watches where condition is paramount. Of course, if you're spending Rolex Explorer money, you're going to want to make sure you look for all of the typical things, originality, condition, authenticity being paramount. As always, check my newsletter to really get into the nitty-gritty of that. But sometimes the most important thing is the story that came along with these watches. I've talked about some of the most expensive watches we've seen from the Rolex Pre-Explorer and Explorer family, but that applies across the line. It doesn't have to be a $300,000 watch that went to the top of Mount Everest. You can find awesome Hamilton Khaki Fields, military-issued Benrus watches, W10s from UK soldiers that have really cool stories that came from military owners that were listed on eBay from original families. Beautiful stories, and I think that provenance is what can make field watches so interesting. These were watches that were worn by hundreds of thousands of people over the second half of the 20th century, and I think that makes it a beautiful utilitarian thing. Field watches are this odd category for watches. They're definitely tool watches, but they don't have a specific purpose like dive watches, pilot's watches, GMT watches. These are watches that were just made for soldiers starting in the 1940s all the way through the mid-century. And now most days I find myself reaching for a tool watch, whether it's a Rolex Explorer, a Hamilton Khaki Field. I used to own that IWC Mark 12, like I said, and so many others in between. It's a watch that just does the job you need of it and nothing else. By the way, it might make for a pretty nice two-watch collection if you watch the previous dress watch video I did about my favorite dress watches from the 1980s and 1990s and neo-vintage era. Some of the most beautiful dress watches from Patek Philippe, Lange, and others. Like I said, this is just the 5th video we've done. Let me know what else you'd like to see from me, and let me know your favorite field watch we covered. I'll see you again soon.